Okay, well, saying about Bake Off, one of the things I have to admit to about Bake Off is I'm a doer, and in the first few series of Bake Off, when my wife had it on, and I'm sitting there, and it's a Wednesday evening, and tea was quite a long time ago, and you're watching cakes and meringues and chocolate and stuff. But I kind of started to get into the habit. The very first time this happened, we were sitting there, and I started to salivate, and I said to my wife, "This is just ridiculous." She said, "What are you doing?" I'm just popping out to the kitchen just for a minute, and I thought, look, I can make dinners. I've just never made a cake before. It can't be that complicated. So I pulled down a recipe book and found this recipe, and my wife came out about 35 minutes later, and there was flour and sugar and grease and stuff everywhere. But in the oven was my first ever cake. And you know what? The satisfaction of actually having made a cake was just amazing. It tasted okay. But I did feel slightly satisfied by the end of it. And it just, the title tonight is Satisfied, and the number you're supposed to be texting in questions as I go along. And at the end, we're going to come up with some answers, hopefully. But it does just roll on from that, doesn't it? That sense of satisfaction, I have to tell you now, I have probably made, I'm getting an old hand, I've probably made at least 10 cakes, and the sense of satisfaction has dropped to a sense of just, hey, so it's time to make another cake. And they still taste okay, but the satisfaction has dropped away. Life is like that, isn't it? Just that sense of new and satisfied, and am I ready for it? I wonder whether you guys have ever heard of a book called Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. When I was your age, it was really current. Probably isn't quite so current now. But there is a famous question in it, which is, what is the meaning to life, the universe, and everything? And if you've ever heard of it or read it, then you will know that that according to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the answer to life, the meaning, life, the universe, and everything is? 42. Thank you. Somebody knew. 42, exactly. You're about 50 or something, are you? Yeah? No. It's 42, that's right. It's a comedy, but it's a real question. It's a real question that all of us ask all the time. What is the meaning to life? In other words, why am I here? What is going on? Why anything? Does it mean? What's life about? Why do I bother? Why should I try something else? Am I truly satisfied with where I am and where I'm going and what's going on? And where do you look for answers to a question like that? Because it's a really good question. Actually, if you've come to university, then it's a great question, because you get onto this treadmill, don't you? Part of the answer to your trying to work out your education and stuff is to end up as a smiley, satisfied, happy, content, etc., complete person at the end. Where do you look for answers to questions like that? Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist writer, had a go. And let me read this to you. He said, "After sleeping through 100 million centuries, we finally opened our eyes on a sumptuous planet, sparkling with color, bountiful with life. Within decades, we must close our eyes again. Isn't it a noble and enlightened way of spending our brief time in the sun to work at understanding the universe and how we come to wake up in it?" This is how I answer when I am asked, as I am surprisingly often, why I bother to get up in the morning. So Dawkins says that when he gets up each day, knowing that each day is meaningless, he does so with the express purpose of trying to enjoy himself, because he knows that sooner or later he's going to die. So just eat, drink, and be merry, because that's what life's about, isn't it, after all? Make the most of it. If you've drawn the same conclusion? Actually, it's a really dangerous conclusion to draw. If you look, most of you guys they don't do history at Bath, do they? No. Or most of you guys are not doing history and may not know this, but if you follow the pattern of the 20th century, actually it's that kind of, well, it's all meaningless, so let's make what we can of it anyway, that ended up with a philosophy called nihilism, that ended up with leading to the Third Reich, that ended up with Hitler and so on. Just make the most of whatever you can, because life is meaningless anyway. And most people don't think of it that deeply. I guess most of us don't. But I do reckon that is the way most people live life. I went to a funeral of a neighbor this afternoon, a secular funeral, and all they had to say about this really nice bloke, actually, who lived a few doors away from me, was he was brilliant at DIY. He loved his family. And that was it. The guy that ran the funeral said, he's just going to become another part of the great cycle of the universe again. And that's it. So it goes like this. You're born, you grow up, you may or may not get married, you have kids, you retire, and you die. And those kids are born, they grow up, they may or may not get married, they have kids and they retire, and they die. And so it goes on kind of ad infinitum, just living for the sake of it. And sure, it's interspersed with holidays and big occasions. The danger, actually, if you stop and think about it, is that in the end it all seems to be a bit pointless. I'm 46 years old, and the most interesting trend, I think, in my lifetime has been the rise of what they now call theme parks. Stuff like Longleat and Alton Towers and all that kind of thing, Chessington World of Adventure. And what's really interesting about them is not just that they happen, but now that they're thriving and they're a real money-making exercise. Do you know why they're a money-making exercise? Because they've worked out that people live their lives all week in drudgery, or that's at least how it feels. And when it comes to the weekend, they feel a great obligation to invest in a memorable experience. So, with their spouse or their partner or their kids or their friends or whoever, they go for that memorable experience. They're willing to pay for it, to get into... I'll never forget the first time we ever walked up to Legoland as a family. My wife, me, and 4 little kids, and it was going to cost, about 150 quid to get in. I nearly died. I just started praying. How am I going to 150? But that's what people do normally. Somebody gave us a voucher, by the way, that halved it, but even so. That was an answer to prayer. You might want to text a question about that. But people go for the memorable experience so they can go back on Monday morning to work without the sense of drudgery. And what's interesting is if people don't have the memorable experience over the weekend, then they go back to work feeling really, really hard done by. Now, you may not be into theme parks. For you, it may be parties or clubbing or whatever, fly fishing or something. But I tell you what, most people have that kind of philosophy in life. What people do to find some kind of satisfaction then is they let their appetites rule. They just try to look for meaning, and they follow and let their appetites rule. And of course, by appetite, I mean, appetites for all sorts of things. We have appetites for stuff, a kind of materialism, more the latest, the best, the newest, the shiniest, whatever. Or maybe just appetites for money, or maybe appetites for power, the way we influence others, and of course, appetite for sex. Don't need to say much about that, that's obvious. Or our appetite for fun or for distraction, or our appetite for filling your own gap. Whatever it is that you think you will get a kick out of, fill in the gap. But think for a moment, if you actually just follow life following your appetite, is that really going to work? Is that what it's all about? Well, maybe the way to find out if that's what life is all about is to try it. Just try following an appetite that gives you money, loads of it, or an appetite that gives you loads of sex, or an appetite that gives you loads of distraction, of course, that's not possible for most of us, thankfully. But actually, in that reading a few moments ago that was given from that book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible, there was a guy who wrote that book who had tried it. It was written by someone who refers to himself as the teacher. If you get a Bible, you look in the Old Testament, the first half of the Bible, and you look at the book of Ecclesiastes, it's all written by this bloke called the teacher. But it's fairly easy to spot that the guy has power and influence, and it's probably King Solomon, who's a big character in the Bible. The book is all about testing the question of meaning, and it starts with these words. I'll read them to you, and then we'll throw up some others. Meaningless, meaningless. This is the book's start, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What does man gain from all his labor as he toils under the sun? Just to explain for a second, this is a guy who can do everything. We're going to see that in a second. But he's looked at life under the sun. In other words, from our perspective, as just human beings walking on the earth. And a bit like Dawkins, he commits himself to try absolutely everything, including making things and indulging in his creativity and getting more stuff and getting loads of money and relishing his power and getting all the sex he could possibly want. And he describes it in chapter 2 of the book. And we'll throw up what he says. If you just click it. So he says, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and I planted vineyards. When he says he did it, he got people to do it. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves. Bear in mind this is 3,000 years ago, okay? Or more, 4,000. And had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone else in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself, and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired men and women singers, a harem, as well as the delights of the heart of a man. Just use your imagination, or maybe don't. I became greater by far, he says, than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all of this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for my labor. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Imagine having that kind of opportunity, so that you arrive with just the ability to do anything you like. There's a lot of talk at the moment about whether Clinton or Trump are going to win the American presidential election. I don't know. I'm not a politician. I'm not going to comment. None of my business. But I'll tell you what, whichever one does win, there's going to be a Senate and a House of Representatives and all the rest of it that's going to stop them doing whatever it is they want. Even the most powerful person in the world doesn't have this kind of influence, not of an absolute monarch. No, this guy has this kind of opportunity. So much money, you can build whatever you like, where you like. So much power that everyone does exactly what they're told without question. And so much whatever that having a harem is okay. If it was Solomon, let me tell you, he had 1,000 wives. 1,000. One wife for every day for 3 years. Just add that up for a second. But he tries it all, and he says it's all pointless. Now, you and I may never imagine living life like that. And anyway, you kind of might say, yeah, that's all very well for him, but come on. He's not really being fair. See, it's good to use our creativity to make things, isn't it? Well, of course it is. And having money isn't meaningless. You need money to survive. And the answer to that is, of course you do. Of course you do. And having power, or at least some influence, well, that isn't meaningless if you use it correctly. And great good can be done with power, which of course is what the politicians are trying to convince us, which is why they would want us to give the best ones power. And sex. Sex isn't meaningless. Sex is fantastic. It was a gift of God. And the answer is it is fantastic. In fact, were you to turn over in the Bible from Ecclesiastes, the very next book is a book called The Song of Solomon, which is so racy and clear about sex that I'm told that a Jew wasn't allowed to read it until he was 30 years old. It was kind of that powerful. You're all going to rush home now and read The Song of Solomon. It's great. But it's great. It's a great model of what God intended. But remember, see, if your priority, and this is what he was saying, is creativity, or your priority is money, or your what you live for is power, or what you live for is sex, or what you live for is fill in the gaps, then one day you're going to die and you're going to leave it all behind. And it may be that you live till 80 or 90. It may be that you live to 25 or 30. But whatever it is, you're going to leave it all behind. And you see, the problem in the end with letting our appetites rule is that then in the end they start to dominate us. Have you ever noticed that? Just imagine for a moment that you could have that kind of pudding opportunity every single day. Apart from the fact you'd get sick to death of it, just imagine what it would do to your shirt. You know, it would start to dominate your thinking. It would be the thing that would dominate your mind. The book of Ecclesiastes goes on to describe some of this, but let me put it this way. As you have more money, so you find you can use more, so you want more, so you use more, so it's never enough. And making things and having stuff is great, but in the end it's never enough. There's always more to do, always more to have. Sadly, almost all the creativity runs dry. Over the years I've met people who are really, really rich. And what I notice is that in accumulating wealth, for them it's become an end in itself. They build it up until they don't know what to do with what they have. Power is the same. How quick have you noticed how the powerful are quickly forgotten? I think I've lived probably through 7 or 8 prime ministers, and every prime minister I've ever lived through, in the end, has left office disappointed, disillusioned, or been thrown out by the electorate or by their party. That's what's going to happen. Have you noticed nobody's talking about Barack Obama anymore in the States? Nobody? Everyone's talking about Clinton or Trump. Why? Because power is measured and people forget. Everyone moves on. And sex, well, you don't need to read the Song of Solomon for me to tell you it only lasts a moment. And the reality is, folks, one day you're going to be too old. And then what? If that's what you live for, you end your days in frustration. At the start of his life, the famous singer Elvis Presley, or the so-called king of rock, told a reporter that his goals throughout his life were to be rich and famous and happy. And speaking just before he died, to the same reporter, about 20 years later, he was asked whether he was rich, famous, and happy, whether he'd achieved his goals. He said, "Rich, I am so rich, I could wallpaper my house in Gracelands with $100 bills and not notice. Famous, I am more famous than the presidents of the United States. Happy, he said, I am as miserable as sin and as lonely as hell." He'd had all of that opportunity, and it had led to nothing. Come back to that passage that I asked to be read just a few moments ago. It kind of sums it all up. So, let's throw it up, can we? Yeah. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Look, verse 2 there. Eyes fade, muscles grow weak. Look at verse 2. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars grow dark, and the clouds return after the rain. And when the keepers of the house tremble, and the strong men stoop, and the grinders cease because they're few, and those looking through the windows grow dim. Or the hearing goes, verse 4 there, when the doors to the streets are closed, and the sound of grinding fades. When men rise up at the sound of birds, but all their songs grow faint. Or confidence goes along with libido, verse 5. When men are afraid of heights and of diggers in the streets, and when the almond tree blossoms and the grasshopper drags himself along and desire is no longer stirred. Or when death comes, when the man goes to his eternal home, verse 6, and mourners go about in the streets. Remember him, remember your Creator before the silver cord is severed, or the golden bowl is broken, before the pitcher is shattered at the spring, or the wheel broken at the well, and the dust returns to the ground from whence it came, the spirit returns to God who gave it. What's the answer to a bleak picture like that? Because his conclusion in the end is actually, if that's all there is to life, that you're living for what's under the sun, then it is just meaningless, and you will not find satisfaction there. And it doesn't matter how rich or how famous or how hot or how anything you are, in the end, you're going to draw that conclusion. Is the answer bleak? Well, under the sun it is. But actually, that's not the only perspective we can come with our lives, thank God. And that's because most people in the world don't have access to much money or much power. And the truth about living for sex, well, it rather quickly becomes obvious. And the book of Ecclesiastes finds the same answer, which is why it tells us to remember our Creator. If what we can see is all there is, then Dawkins is right. You might just as well enjoy it because it's going to be over quick. But if the Bible is right and there is a God, then living life in some reference to him, actually in relationship with him, provides an entirely different perspective. This meeting's been organized by the Christian Union, and that is, it's been organized by Christians who believe that there is another perspective to life, that you don't have to find satisfaction just in what's under the sun, that you can find real satisfaction, lasting satisfaction, can I say eternal satisfaction, in a relationship that will last forever. We're not here because of some cosmic accident. We're here for a purpose. And the great news, the good news, which Christians call the gospel, is that in the person of Jesus Christ, God stepped into our apparently meaningless existence to bring us back to himself. As he spoke in John's gospel about, in the Bible, in the New Testament, the second half, about bringing people back to know God, he said these amazing words. Just throw them up, will you, John 10? Jesus said his purpose in coming to the whole world in the first place, he said that I've come that people may have life, real life, and have it to the full. So a Christian's perspective on what life is about, real life, is that we should certainly work hard to use the gifts God's given us, but life does not depend on them. There is more to it than that. Let me give you a different incident from John's Gospel, again in the New Testament of the Bible, where Jesus said this. He's talking to a woman who's tried all sorts of some of the stuff that I've been describing. And they're having a discussion a little bit bizarrely about well water that she's trying to get. And she's offered to get him a drink, and it's all getting a bit complicated. And he says to her, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I will give him will never thirst. Indeed, he says, the water I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. See, in this world, we all live with brokenness all the time. That is our constant experience. We are not satisfied in the here and now. We're just not. It always lets us down. And that is because in a broken world, we're trying to find meaning in what was never designed to do so. Our real meaning was always intended to be in relationship with our Creator. But when we try to find meaning in the created, then we're turning our backs on him. Actually, we're rebelling against him. We're pretending he either isn't there or he doesn't matter. The Bible calls that kind of treatment of God, the Bible calls it sin. And it's a bit like me having a relationship with you and then turning my back on you and pretending that you don't matter and I don't care what you think and I'm going to ignore you anyway. We do that to God all the time. Trying to find satisfaction in all this stuff that he's given us is exactly like doing that. But actually, in Jesus, there is real hope because he is the real rescuer from that situation. You may know that in the Bible, it's described how, having had those kind of interactions with people and lots of others, he eventually was nailed to a cross. It's an extraordinary thing to consider. What's going on there is not that he was an unpopular bloke for whom the plan had gone wrong politically. But what's going on there is that God had on purpose sent him as a rescuer into the world. Do you know, as Jesus hung on the cross, and God had taken all of the grottiness of the world, all that brokenness, all that rebellion I've just described, all that turning your back on God, as God took it in a way we find it very difficult to understand. He took it off us and he laid it on Jesus. And Jesus hung on the cross, paying the punishment of hell for our rebellion. He said these amazing words right at the end. You'd find it again in John's Gospel. He says something extraordinary. He says, "It is finished." That's what the English translation says. Only in the original that it was written, it's much more powerful than that. Because "it is finished" sounds like, phew, that's over. That isn't what it means. As he hung on a cross, it actually says, "Done it!" That's the word. Done it. I have achieved everything necessary to rescue people. And having done it for us, having taken the punishment we deserve, suddenly, miraculously, the satisfied question that we're asking with what's under the sun is answered. I don't have to turn my back on God anymore. I don't have to pretend that he isn't there and doesn't matter. I don't have to live for myself with the penalty of hell to pay for eternity for having pretended that God isn't there. Actually, if I do what Jesus said, which is, he actually said repent and believe. It just means if I just stop going my way, putting myself first, turning my back on God and say, God, I know actually I deserve punishment for the way I treat you, but please, I want to turn my life around. I want to put you first. I want to find satisfaction in you alone. I want that water actually that Jesus offers. I want the forgiveness that he brings. That turning and trusting, that act of becoming a Christian as I've just described, God, please save me, rescue me, actually means that I will start to realize that satisfaction is not found in what's under the sun, but satisfaction is found in him. And anyone that's a Christian has done something like that. They have turned and asked Jesus to save them. With the result, actually, that they live life not just with the perspective of what's under the sun, but with the perspective of forever. So you get the last quote I'm just going to throw up now, which is this. It's one of the letters towards the end of the Bible. A guy called Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, he wrote to some early Christians, and he wrote these amazing words. He said, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, because in his great mercy, he has given us new birth, a new identity into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and thereby into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil or fade, kept in heaven for you." Let me tell you, if you're not a Christian this evening, if you've never actually asked God to rescue you in the way I've described, then you can. And you can look forward to that inheritance, a future forever that doesn't stop, by asking Jesus to save you. Just stop. Just recognize that you're finding satisfaction in the wrong stuff, that in so doing you're rebelling against God, and ask him to receive you and to save you. And he promises to do that. Now, I've finished for now. But I guess I think you're going to have some more puddings, and I hope you've thrown up some questions, and I'd love just to come back to you.